Welcome back to our discussion of structured finance within the course An Intuitive Introduction to Probability. I showed you in the last lecture on how we can aggregate risks when we pool them and then split them up in novel ways. Here's a quick reminder of what happened. We have these two risks, X and Y, that are either default or don't default. We looked at the four possible combinations, both of them defaulting, one of them defaulting, or finally neither of them defaulting, and the probabilities default 10%, no default 90%. I had shown you when we aggregate those, we have these four possible scenarios, and with the payoffs 0, 1, 1, and 2. And then we had split them up into the investments I and J. When we looked at the probabilities, and I showed you a probability table, we had assumed independence. Independence meant I can use the multiplication rule and take the probabilities from the margins to get the joint probabilities in the inner portion of the table. Now let's think about these risks to be dependent. That X and Y are no longer independent but dependent. Quick reminder, what does that mean? That means when X defaults, that tells me something about the likelihood that Y defaults. In particular, let's now think about a dependence that's also called a positive correlation, where when one asset defaults, actually the probability of the other asset's default increases. Look at this table now. I no longer assume dependence. Remember the upper left-hand corner in the yellow cell, there used to be a 0.01. The product of 0.1 at the bottom left times the 0.1 on the top right. Now let's assume that's wrong and that actually the joint probability is 0.06. Then you can easily fill in the other probabilities. Now let's look at what happens to the investment grade asset I because of the dependence. Now the probability of default is no longer 0.1 squared, 0.01. Now it's 0.06. So now it has a much higher default probability. Actually, it's so high, it is no longer an investment grade asset, it's now a junk asset. On the other hand, J, which before was toxic junk with a gigantic probability of default of 19%, is now slightly better. What has happened? We have junk X plus junk Y, we mix them up into I and J, and it's still junk plus junk. There's no gold. This investment grade I that we had before no longer exists. I is junk too. Now, this is a result of the dependence. Here we have a specific dependence called positive correlation that we will take another look at in the next module. So, the investment grade asset I actually has now a lower value and a higher probability of default as a result of the dependence. So the investment grade asset I is actually much worse now than under the case of independence, while for the junk bond J it's the other way around. The toxic junk is a little less toxic. It's still junk though. Now, why do you have correlation there? For example, if you think companies that are in the same business or in the same industry, if somehow this industry is not doing well, everyone is doing poorly. Or on the other hand, when that industry is doing very well, everyone is doing well. So you have these companies either both all doing well or all doing poorly. In Switzerland, we had this now after the Swiss National Bank stopped the peg of the Swiss franc to the euro. That was a very bad hit to all exporters and in particular also to the tourism industry in Switzerland. That was actually bad for all of them. So there was a dependence through what economists call an exogenous shock. In this case, an exogenous negative shock. And when this happens, and this typically happens in crises, as we had in the financial crisis in 2007 to 2009, we suddenly have the dependence. And then this idea of structured finance, taking junk together and creating some good safe assets that's good enough for you and me as a retail investor or for a pension fund, and toxic junk for the pros and the gamblers, that breaks apart. Junk plus junk is still junk. And so that's at the heart of what happened. Actually, there's great literature on there. If you Google this, I have here a particular highly cited economics research paper with a beautiful quote. And here I highlighted the last sentence. So the problem why the rating agencies misrated and underestimated the risk in some of these assets was exactly this, that there was this dependence among the risks. They had assumed independence ex ante, but later the risks were dependent. And you saw the importance between independence and dependence. And we will see that problem again and again as we move ahead through this course. To summarize, the basic idea of pooling risks in structured finance fails terribly when the risks that you pool have a strong dependence. And this particular issue contributed greatly to the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. There were lots of other issues. There was some cheating going on, some misreporting, there were other problems. However, this particular probability issue clearly contributed to the financial crisis. Now, taking a step back from this particular finance application, the bigger lesson for us is independence versus dependence is a huge issue in probabilities. And so when we multiply probabilities, we always have to ask ourselves, is the assumption of independence justified, yes or no? And if the answer is no, we cannot multiply probabilities. Then we need to think about conditional probabilities. So this wraps up our 2 lectures on structured finance. Now we're going to switch gears entirely and look at law, and in particular cases in courts where probabilities are often misinterpreted. Thanks, and please come back for more applications of probabilities. Thank you.